Hi, I am Rajeswari Ramani, and welcome to Asian Agribiz Podcast, bringing you interviews and updates from the animal protein community throughout Asia from a trusted and dedicated provider of news, information, and market intelligence. In this series, my colleague Payungsak Wiryabunditko is speaking with Grant Parsons about reducing food waste in the meat industry. Grant is an APAC leader for protein solutions, primary and secondary processing at JBT.
Hello, Mr. Glenn. Thank you for giving an interview in this podcast.
Hello, and glad to be with you, Pung Sak. I hope things are well on your end of the world.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, food waste remains one of the biggest global challenges. 1/3 of all food produced ends up lost or wasted every year, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. Also, food waste is a complex issue which involves many stakeholders. For today, I will focus on food waste in the meat sector. So, Mr. Glenn, amid the pandemic, how do you evaluate the current situation with food waste in the meat sector in Asia? What are the main problems and challenges?
Well, as you know, Pung Sak, food waste is a huge issue. And some studies suggest, as you've noted, that a third or half of Southeast Asia's total waste is food waste. And that's kind of in line with the rest of the world. It has a huge impact. And it's often said that the planet doesn't have a food production problem, but rather it's a food distribution problem. And when you think about that, it's really cool that the world currently produces enough food for every man, woman, and child, but getting the food to those people is the issue. Some of that is transportation, but it's also a matter of food waste, not only shelf life and transport, but all parts of the production and supply chains contribute to that inefficiency. And compounding the issue, food waste is a huge generator of greenhouse gas. And some studies have suggested that food waste is responsible for as much as 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions right now. So you're absolutely right. Food waste is a huge challenge to producers across the world.
And especially with the meat sector, how do you evaluate the issue?
Well, on a countrywide basis, food waste is directly related to food production and supply. So larger food producing countries are going to account for a larger proportion of food waste. And at the same time, countries with a better cold storage capacity are going to waste less. If you can freeze or if you can refrigerate, that's key. That freezer capacity preserves the life of food that is generated. At JBT, we think long-term. We combine the fact that the world's land is a fixed commodity and populations are growing. We know that leads to growing supply and demand imbalance, and reducing food waste is key to that. The bottom line is every country in the world could do more to help prevent it. And across the world, producers are working in that direction. As far as the meat industry, as we've said, food waste is not just on the consumer end. People tend to think of it that way as, oh, I threw away food and I wasted it. But every part of the line, from on grow out, processing, packaging, delivery, retail, and end customer, there are points of loss and waste. And that suggests that producers at every part of the supply chain can have an impact. And we believe at JBT that the challenge is best met with technology, by helping food companies have high-tech equipment to get the best yields and generate the least wastes from their operations. And all of that aids in feeding the world more efficiently while reducing waste at the same time. Meat producers in general, yield is king. And by yield, I mean how much meat you get off the bone. And that's for meat processors. Food waste really starts there, getting the most possible meat for consumption. Our machines are tuned to do that, and they do that pretty efficiently. Take chicken processing, for example. on a modern processing line, birds are processed at 200 or more a minute. Capturing even an extra gram or two per bird adds up to millions of kilos a year that otherwise would be lost to waste. JBT prides itself on producing high yielding, high value solutions that aim to get the most meat off the bone. Another step is what you do with the meat after you remove it. In most countries, it involves portioning that meat, producing the cuts that customers want. We'll stick with chicken here, for example. That may mean breast fillets, tender fillets, whole muscle nuggets, strips, cubes, or a whole bunch of types of products that you might be making. So you want to get the most out of meat that you are harvesting. Our water jet portioners are essentially computerized waste reduction machines. They're extremely high tech. They scan each piece of meat coming into the machine. They look at the best cutting paths to portion whatever you need to cut, whether it's strips or nuggets or fillets, and they optimize those cuts for the most yield. The amazing thing is a smart machine can even produce more sellable cuts than a human portioner who is going by eye. The human portioner doesn't have the benefit of that computerized vision technology to compute the actual weight. They're going by their feel. So in those cases, we can actually increase the number of portions. And that technology can also do batch orders. For as soon as a quantity of, say, 6-ounce portions are met, it switches to the next priority of orders, whether that's 4 ounces or 8 ounces. And that ensures that everything's filled without overfilling. So those are some of the examples that we have for meat technology. Generally speaking, production lines, processes are very good at getting the most meat out of the animal, or the longest harvest from grains or whatever. But the end of the day, the problem is food going bad, whether that is because it's not frozen properly, or it's not packaged properly, or some combination of those. Keeping a cold supply chain throughout the entire delivery and logistics line for your productions, that's really key. At the end of the day, food spoilage is probably the largest contributor to food waste. So if you can keep things frozen, if you can keep them cold, and you can keep them properly preserved and packaged, that's a big part of it. A good example of packaging, ProSeal, which is a brand of ours, allows for different types of packaging. The best ones remove the oxygen and the air, the atmosphere from inside the packaging, vacuum sealing it to reduce the amount of air and oxygen that can degrade food. Then we also have a really high-tech solution with a viewer that uses extremely high pressure that takes packaged food, subjects it to a very high pressure. And by high pressure, I mean more pressure than you have at the deepest point in the ocean. That kills bacteria in a very clean way without adding any extra chemicals. Between ProSeal packaging and our viewer high pressure processing, you can sometimes extend the shelf life of food by weeks. And that is very, very important. You notice it not only in preserving food for over time, but you have to realize that adding time before food spoils allows you to transport that food farther. We talked a little bit early on about how we really do, as a world, produce enough food for everyone. The key is getting it to everyone before it spoils. If you extend the shelf life of something by weeks, think of how much farther you can move that food, either by truck in rural areas or by airplane to other places of the world. it's really the key is reducing the spoilage. And that's what you have to focus on once you've removed, maximize the amount of food that you can get from an animal or a process.
Earlier, you mentioned some technology and packaging. I'm just wonder how much does it cost to adopt this technology, and is it affordable for small and mid-sized producers?
It certainly depends on the size and the scale of the project itself. A large project costs more, a small project costs less. But the bottom line is that if you're doing things correctly, these are projects that will pay back. We do return on investment calculations, ROI calculations for all of our technologies. And the bottom line is that what you get back in increased yield, more meat off the bone, or what you get back by less spoilage through a freezer investment, or longer shelf life that you can sell farther away from your base of operations through a good food preservation project. What you wind up with there is something that pays back in profits. Because if food doesn't spoil, you can still sell it. So the percentage of food that a producer may make, they're going to lose a certain percentage of that to spoilage. If you reduce the spoilage and sell it instead, you're making that back as cash money at the end of the day. And so the key is to make sure that the project you're working on, whether it's increasing yield or freezing or packaging or preserving, any of those can pay back more than the cost of the equipment over time. And at a certain point, within a year or two, sometimes even less than that, you've already paid off the machinery and you are making pure profit at that point. So the key is these things can pay back. They bring value to the equation. Each of these technologies allows a producer to make more money. At the absolute bottom line, that's what it does. Food that does not spoil, that is still healthy and nutritious, is food that can be sold and make a profit. And so if you look at it that way, it's a win-win. The company makes more money and less food is wasted.
And do you see more investment of this technology? I mean, increasing yield, reducing spoilage, extended shelf life. Do you see more producers invest in this technology in Asia, especially amid the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the pandemic, and that's an interesting driver because crisis really pushes innovation. And the pandemic is certainly a crisis. And in a lot of cases, it's pushed a lot of the supply chains in new directions. They've had to, restaurants, for example, were closed for a while in many areas. And that shifted interest in ready meals, foods at grocery stores, other outlets for food that weren't used as much. And then restaurants come back online and you have educated consumers to a whole range of options. And there are many more food choices in how you get your food. So especially during the pandemic, especially with people not having, or companies having a harder time staffing plants because of illness or whatever reason, the supply chain is stretched, and it really highlights the need to eliminate food waste so that the existing food can feed even more people. The nice thing about that crisis driving innovation is that as we come out of the pandemic, and thankfully we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, as we come out of that, the lessons we've learned in every part of our society, but in this case, we're talking about food waste and ensuring food supply lines. Those carry over and those become greater efficiencies in the system as everything comes back online. So the answer at the end of the day is yes, very much. The pandemic has pushed people and is resulting in some innovative approaches that will continue to see and innovate in additional investments that we will continue to see by companies from what they've learned during a trying time.
Do you also see more investment in automation amid the COVID-19?
Absolutely. Automation is key. I mentioned a little bit about companies having a hard time if they have a COVID strike within a plant. We've seen some plants close for, several days. Suddenly they're, that's a huge supplier offline. We've seen plants stressed even more because if they don't close, maybe some of their workers are not coming in because of illness. They have to do more. So even more than normal, they realize that automation certainly does help fill that gap. And we are certainly seeing at JBT a lot more increasing interest in automation. And as I say, that crisis driving innovation, as we come out of this, you're seeing more and more people willing to increase automation. They're willing to increase strategies of food preservation and packaging to increase shelf life, to reduce food spoilage because of the lessons they've learned in the pandemic, but also because they're seeing the efficiencies they can bring to the system. And at the end of the day, they're seeing that they can make more money. So if you can make more money while you're helping the planet, that's a win-win.
So which country in Asia do you see more investment in automation and technology for increased yield and increased extended shelf life? Which country that are paying more attention to this?
Well, certainly the more developed countries are more on the cutting edge of this. So your Japans, your Koreas, Australia, to a large extent, China, Thailand. These are more developed countries. They have fairly involved supply lines. They're seeing the need to invest. But and that's where a lot of the dollars are coming from. If you look at the gross number of dollars coming in, the largest number of dollars. But at the same time, a lot of the other countries, Indonesia, India, to a certain extent, some of the other Southeast Asian countries, they are also seeing the need as well. And the nice thing is that there's not one solution for everyone. And that's one thing that we stress here at JBT. There are different levels of solution depending on how much you are producing or supplying. So we're seeing increased interest across the board. The size of the project might be different depending on which country or which industry you're in or which product you're producing. But we're seeing very much an increase as we're coming out of the pandemic. As we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, we're seeing an increase in interest and we're seeing an increase in spending. So yes.
Yeah, it depends on the size of the project and maybe the level of investment. But let's say a producer, they are interested in, reduce food waste. Where should they start? I mean, what question do they have to ask themselves and maybe thinking hardly before they go and implementing this?
As we've noted, it's really every step of the line. So, and a lot of food producers do this as a matter of course anyway, but it's become more important that they do this. But you basically do an audit. So you look at every step of your line, and you can't improve what you don't measure. and producers know this, and they measure a lot. So they measure how many pounds come in, how many pounds go out, how many go to each process. Once you start doing that baseline audit, then you start to realize where your leakage is, where your spoilage is, where you're losing yield, where you're losing through waste, where you're losing through spoilage. And those are the areas you need to look at. A company like JBT and others can certainly help you evaluate those areas and suggest solutions that work to improve each of those areas. So generally speaking, it starts with measuring what you're doing now, knowing what you're doing now, and discovering where your waste is. And a lot of producers do this as a matter of course. And then, you work with a company like JBT. You can reach us at jbtc.com to plug those holes and plug the gaps. At the end of the day, everyone's working at the same goal, and that's to feed more people, to reach more people with the food we have, to preserve the food we have longer, and to feed the world. As we've noted, the world makes enough food to feed everyone, which is something that I think we often lose sight of, because you do see problems with people going hungry. But we make enough food for everyone. The key is getting it to them and keeping it from spoiling. And that's where all of our customers, they're focused on that. And that's what we at JBT are focused on helping them do.
Okay, that is very interesting, Mr. Grant. Thank you so much for your time and your analysis.
Thank you for listening to another Asian Agribiz podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast from. This is Rush, signing off.